Global economic crises have always been triggered by economic situation in the United States of America. But today, East Asia controls a large chunk of global trade with China on the driver's seat. With economic growth in China slowing down, the world sits on the edge. An asset price bubble in China is bound to cause ripples in the international market. The program is Economic SearchLight on Splash 105.5 FM, the Integrity Station. Today's edition of the program will focus on China, the second biggest economy in the world. Professor Alaba Ogunsanwo, an expert in China, will be looking at the political and economic indicators that define the present Chinese system. As part of the discussion, we will look at Nigeria's relations with China and see if the country can replicate the Chinese model. I am Edmund Obilo. Good morning and welcome. The Chinese economy since the turn of the 1980s has been growing annually at a GDP of 10%, an achievement that speedily pushed it to the position of the second largest economy in the world. The Chinese system borrowed from the Asian development model, a model that saw Japan taking the world by storm. The Asian tigers like Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan keyed into the model and created a spectacular economic success that has been defined by some economic experts as the greatest surge of wealth in human history. The model wiped out poverty on an unprecedented scale and built industries at spell-binding pace. China ran with the model from the 1970s when its leader, Deng Xiaoping, opened up the country to capitalist instrument, however, with strong government regulation. After a long period of growth, China's economy is slowing down with GDP at 7.3%. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, expects GDP growth in China to slow further. In the September 2014 edition of The Time, Michael Schumer is of the view that China may be heading for a Japanese-style economic crisis. Japan's restructuring of its economy and politics after World War II saw it rise to the pinnacle of the world economy from the 1970s. It became the next big economy after the United States. China's astronomical growth rate pushed Japan off the second position. The fear or reality, as some would say, is that the financial crisis that pierced the Japanese economy has now caught up with that of China. The Time magazine makes reference to a report by the strategists Naoki Kamiya and David Coles at the Bank of America Merrill Lynch. From the report, China's development, unfortunately, has largely followed the script written by Japan some 30 years ago. As a result, China is facing the same problem Japan encountered in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Among the problems China faces today are imbalanced growth, government stimulus, overcapacity, an overwrought housing market, and a severely undercapitalized financial system. Despite the slower growth, China's economic GDP still leaves it at a very comfortable position to influence world affairs. If it continues to grow at even 6%, it will continue to open the gap between it and Western economies that have an average growth rate of 2%. However, the slowdown of the growth of the Chinese economy will affect Africa's economy adversely. The South African stock market, particularly the largest in Africa, will lose investment as Chinese investors will have less fund for foreign businesses. This also applies to the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Remember, China is now the number one trading partner for most African countries. It has more than $20 billion investment in addition to aid on the continent. President Goodluck Jonathan, while preparing to receive the Premier of China, granted an interview to CCTV where he talked about the importance of China to Nigeria.
I have a robust relationship for quite some time. You have a lot of Chinese businessmen operating in Nigeria, quite a number of successful companies in Nigeria. The foreign direct investment of China to Nigeria now is over $15 billion. So presently it's quite significant. And of course, you recall that I visited China not too long ago, last year. So the Premier visiting Nigeria now is very, very important to us. Because while in China, there are quite a number of areas that we discussed things that have not been well concluded. And there are also new things that we think we can interface with China. So they are coming significant. Of course, you know that even our trade relationship with China is quite huge. We import an average of about $10 billion worth of goods from China. Among the top 20 most important items we import, those are the very regular things we import. 40% of that come from China. So you really see the importance of the visit. It will help us open new areas that we think will place before the Chinese government to handle. The Chinese companies are into almost everything. The issue of foreign direct investment, they are into oil. Of course, you know, they are quite strong in oil. They are also into infrastructure, like power infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. They are also into light manufacturing, but not quite significant. These are the areas we want to emphasize that they should beef up. Of course, some attempts also is made in the area of agriculture, but not too significant. In fact, when I was in China, that is one area we discussed about the rice production in Nigeria. We are the biggest importers of rice, and we want to see that we produce enough rice for our people.
A devaluation of the Chinese currency, the yuan, will result in less demand for African goods. With 50% collapse in the price of oil, countries like Angola and Sudan will feel the pinch of a decline in the Chinese economy in the sense that the favorable trade exchange to buy oil cheaply through negotiated Chinese loans will witness a setback. As we talk, China has cut down on the volume of oil it buys from Nigeria. The impact is obvious, as most states of the Federation cannot pay their workers. Governor Abiola Ajimobi of Oyo State explains. Insert: Governor Abiola Ajimobi, Nigeria's oil. While China's economy slows down, the quarrel over the South China Sea threatens political and economic situation in that part of the world. I will be looking at this with the renowned international relations scholar, Professor Alaba Ogunsanwo, after this break, so don't go away. The program is Economic SearchLight on Splash 105.5 FM, the Integrity Station. The struggle over the islands of the South China Sea raises questions about the stability of East Asia. In this interview with Nigeria's former ambassador to the European Union, Professor Alaba Ogunsanwo, we analyze the situation there. I started by calling his attention to the recent display of China's military power during the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in Beijing. Why is China trying to display its military power at this time?
Well, I think it's important to take the historical perspective and see what in fact went on in the past. First of all, Japan attacked China in 1931 in Manchuria and seized the entire province. And then in 1937, during the so-called Marco Polo incident, it used it as an opportunity to begin a massive invasion of the northeast of China. And that, in fact, was seen as the commencement of the Second World War in the Far East by Japan. China was weak at that point in time, and it took a lot of sacrifice. The Chinese, during the Second World War, in the war of resistance against Japan, lost 20 million dead. That usually is not taken into consideration when historians in Europe are recounting the experiences of the Second World War. It was disastrous for China, but eventually Japan was defeated as a result of a coalition of several forces, which of course included the United States, that eventually saw the surrender of the Japanese forces. That was 70 years ago when the defeat occurred. And China is saying now, not again, never again will a Japan, a smaller neighbor in terms of population, be able to come up and attack China. It will not happen again. By showing that it has the capacity to defend itself, it is not saying that China wishes to attack Japan in retaliation. Indeed, the same time that the Chinese government is showing that the country has indeed arrived in terms of its being able to defend itself with whatever weapons necessary, it's the same time that the president announced that the size of the armed forces is being reduced by 300,000, which means you can only do that if you are confident that you have taken your armed forces to the level of preparedness in terms of equipment, in terms of ability, capacity to defend the nation before you do that.
China's present military strategy of active defense, don't you think is capable of destabilizing the region, considering what is going on with the South China Sea?
In terms of the South China Sea, there is undoubtedly some disagreement between China and some of the neighbors in terms of so-called historical claims to some territories in those areas. Some of the weaker and smaller neighbors of China are trying to argue that if you go by the law of the sea, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, signed in Montego in 1982, December 10, that if you go by that particular convention, some of the areas that China now is claiming, which it says had historically been part of China, can really not be supported by any international legal understanding from that particular angle, the law of the sea. And therefore, they insist that they have more right in those areas which are nearer to them territorially than to China. China, of course, because of this other part of historical claim, has said that, well, it's really not so, that you cannot ignore history. What was in existence long before the Montego Bay 1982 Convention on the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea was signed. And therefore, they want to continue to assert their right to say that they continue to lay claim to those areas that they believed historically had belonged to China. Yes, the U.S., for example, has opposed some of these claims by saying that in terms of what the Chinese Navy is trying to do, that it is indeed trying to operate within international waters, which China claims to be its own waters, and that countries like the United States would not tolerate that, would operate in the area as international waters, not as Chinese waters. We're not talking of the name of the area, but in terms of what international law expects to be the high seas, and therefore not subject to appropriation by any of the neighboring states.
The tension there is palpable. There are reclamation activities already going on.
Yes.
China on one side, and the Philippines is also reclaiming land. The Philippines have said if China does not stop reclamation, it will not stop. Recently, Singaporean leader talked about the same situation, that China must not bully its way into the islands of the South China Sea. Don't you think the tension will boil over?
I don't think the tension will boil over, precisely because the other smaller countries understand the limit to which they can go. They expect that the United States, which is the one that is defending them, will come to their assistance if the crunch comes to it. But the Chinese are also careful. The last thing they want to do is to draw the United States into the area on a permanent basis. They do not want that. And therefore, the Chinese are suggesting to these states that they can negotiate bilaterally to resolve these problems. These smaller countries believe that they are standing each one on its own weak, and therefore they need a collective negotiating position in order to be able to relate to China. But I do not think that Cambodia on its own can do anything, Vietnam on its own can, or Philippines on its own can. Not to talk of small Singapore. None of them can do anything against China militarily. Therefore, that's why they would prefer that the United States use its influence and comes nearer to prevent this, what some of them believe will eventually be overbearing military preponderance. That the Chinese government now is talking of the rise of China by peaceful means. This is the first time in the history of the world that a great power has arisen without war. It is the first time. It's never happened before. You don't see the emergence, peaceful emergence of a great power in that, in this type of situation. So the neighbors are saying future Chinese leaders can be aggressive. They may not want to lay emphasis on peace the way the current leadership is doing. And that therefore, essentially, they think that they should begin to continue to emphasize their own position with reference to their own interests and get support of the international community.
Do you think the internationalization of the conflict over the South China Sea is in the interest of the United States?
Yes, it is in the interest of the United States, because the U.S. also believes, and this is the reality, that China taking Vietnam one-on-one, taking Cambodia one-on-one, or Philippines one-on-one, that China cannot but prevail, and therefore would be overwhelming if you do not have a form of internationalization of the whole issue. The ASEAN countries, who also have tried to let China know that they don't feel easy. It's these countries, after all, were around in the past when Japan embarked on its own aggression in those days, out of the feeling that it was superior and there was no other country militarily around that could take it on. They too were victims of the Japanese aggression in those days, and they believe they have the right now to begin to ask questions. Will China in future, whether it is 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, do what Japan had done in the past when it thought that its power was not matchable in that particular area?
Do you think China in the years to come will be overbearing?
Well, you cannot predict from that particular angle. The Chinese know that indeed their greatest, shall we say, advantage is that of being seen as an economic giant, not a military superpower that is around to lord it over them and to fight them.
Well, the display of the week, it has shown it is a military power.
It is a military power. There's nobody that is denying that. It is not just your military capability. Your intention is important. what you intend to do with the military capability that you have. Currently, the United States is the strongest military power in the world. But that itself is simply taken for granted. It is what you want to do with the power that other countries are concerned about.
The discussion with Professor Alaba Ogunsanwo continues after this break, but this time we'll be looking at China, Nigeria. The program is Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM, the Integrity Station. Formal relations between Nigeria and China were established in February 1971. Since then, trade relations between both countries have been tilted in favor of China, with Nigeria, in the present circumstance, not likely to catch up soon. From 1999, trade relations between both countries improved dramatically, reaching 3 billion in 2006 to more than 7 billion in 2008. Nigeria's only export to China is oil, while China imports all sorts of goods into the country. Obasanjo signed the Oil for Infrastructure deal with China to help improve the state of infrastructure in Nigeria. But the deal was cancelled by President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, who took over from him. This slowed down the modern railway project that the Chinese had agreed to implement. The interview with Professor Alaba Ogunsanwo, an expert on China, continues. We have an Africa that relies on China to a very large extent. Countries like Ethiopia, Angola rely on China. Do you think this reliance will, in the long run, help most African countries to develop?
You can look at it from two angles. If you take the position that right now, more than 50% of the construction work, infrastructure and other things going on in African countries is being carried out by Chinese companies, then you see the magnitude of the participation of China in the developmental projects of African states. These states were in the past colonies. Of course, Ethiopia was not really a colony of any country, but most African countries were colonies of the European powers, and which did virtually nothing in terms of bringing them up. Since independence, several efforts have been made to get these countries to move on. These efforts have also failed largely, to the extent that you had a considerable number of African countries being referred to as the highly indebted poor countries. And they have enormous resources, natural resources, which the West needs. Unfortunately, they do not have the technology to turn these resources round. Earlier on, we mentioned Japan without resources, which had to go out to bring resources in and to use technology to convert. The African leaders controlling these economies had not been able to do that in the past. One of the critical areas is infrastructure. And that's where the Chinese have said, we're ready to partner with you in terms of whatever it is that you want to do. But in terms of you relying entirely on us, that is not so. This is a partnership of equals. At least that's what the Chinese say. The Africans know that as at the moment, it is not really a partnership of equals. That the African states need more from China than at the moment that it can give. But that this has to be done in such a way as to ensure that the future plans of the African states take into consideration the primary interests of the states themselves. In the final analysis, the future in terms of economic development, vibrancy, and the rest of that of any African state depends on the African state itself, not on China or on the United States. So, if you know what you want, you will know what it is that you want from outside and what you don't want. You don't just accept anything that is thrown at you in the name of assisting you to develop.
In your paper entitled Nigeria and China, you were trying to talk about the 1971 agreement. And you said here, a unique agreement on economic and technical cooperation was signed between the two countries and a trade agreement. The agreement on trade was hardly meaningful, as it had no impact on the largely unregulated imports of Chinese goods into Nigeria that had gone for years and were to become more impossible to control in years ahead. Has anything changed?
Not much has changed, except that now you have the Chinese side coming in officially and buying from the Nigerian state and sectors of the state those things that it requires. The Chinese economy is hungry for resources. Part of those resources relate to gas and oil and gas. And so they've been interested in Nigeria's oil resources. We also have other solid minerals which they are interested in. But in the past, what was simply happening was the Nigerian side ignored the possibilities, the potentialities of relating to China and left what was happening to individuals who were going there, bringing back containers of goods to be sold here. You understand? And therefore, from that particular angle, it really was not controlled. Since then, you've had situations in which the successive Nigerian governments have tried to tap into part of what they saw was the strength of China, bringing them in to participate in the infrastructural development in this country. They are now part of the process of the railway construction, the railway rehabilitation system that we're undertaking. They are part of the road project. They are in oil. They are part of the efforts to get something refined. The latest example in terms of the partnership between Nigerian private sector and China, involving the Dangote group of companies, reaching agreement with the Chinese counterpart to build cement factories in 11 countries, one in Nepal, the others in African countries. With that type of collaboration, it's clear that yes, those things which did not happen in the past are beginning to happen now, and that hopefully you can talk of mutual benefit in terms of what the two countries stand to gain from such interactions.
What can Nigeria learn from China, considering what Xi Jinping did with his country in the 1970s? Can we replicate that?
The answer is no, because each country has a different historical experience. Nigeria is irrepressibly pluralistic. You have a situation where there is no united position. Everything is almost always in disunity in terms of how you pursue things. the way some people want to do things is perceived differently. And the various political factors and forces in Nigeria will not allow the country to speak with one voice or go in one particular direction. Somebody does something and you start making noise about it. Look at the events last week when the president, after being criticized for so long, announced the appointment of some of his close officers, secretary to the government, chief of staff, and all of that. And the whole criticism came to say, this is not, this is tribalistic. It's not something that we were expecting. We thought he would follow the federal character. But the guy has not yet appointed his ministers. The Constitution is clear. It says that for ministers to be appointed, they must reflect the federal character of the country, which means a minister must come from every state. It's only when the president has appointed ministers and you have some states left out that you can begin to talk of this so-called marginalization, but not on the basis of individuals who he believes will work closely in contact with him one-on-one. In terms for those positions, you need those that you can trust and that you know. And there is nothing that in the Constitution that says that must reflect federal character. Federal character is supposed to be reflected in the civil service, when you appoint your ministers, when you appoint your ambassadors. All of those things are clearly stated when you appoint permanent secretaries. That's federal character is supposed to be reflected in that particular area. So something that is really of not much importance, so much emphasis is placed on it, to the extent that whatever honeymoon the president thought he was enjoying was beginning to appear to be coming to an end.
Should we be moving closer to China or to the United States?
Nigeria should identify its own core national interests and operate in a way that places emphasis on those core interests, the interests of the people. The center, our concentration should be on Nigeria, not on the US or on China or on Russia. Nigeria must be the center. And if it is the center, then the question that you need to ask each time is, what is in our interest? What will be to our own best advantage in this type of situation? What should we do? It's not what will US like us to do or what will China like us to do, but what is it that is of benefit to Nigeria? That is the first question that you ask. Other countries can come in later, but the primary thing is what is of vital interest to Nigeria.
You've been part of Nigeria's foreign policy from the 1970s. Buhari is here. What do you think is in the vital interest of Nigeria? How should we pursue our foreign policy now?
Well, in terms of our foreign policy, the foundation is laid by what we do at home. We have to put our house in order. We have disgraced the country over the years, all of those months leading to the elections. Some of the things that the leaders were saying, both those who are in power now, who were in opposition then, and those who were in power then, who are no longer in power, what was coming out from them about the country could only be said to be inimical to Nigeria. The problems that we have would need to be faced. The national question would need to be faced. The structure of the federation would need to be faced. The resources and the allocation of resources. These are things which need to be faced. And until you deal with those fundamental issues, where then you can begin to talk of emphasis laid on development, competition for advancement between the various zones or states within the federation. Until you are able to do that, then you cannot really lay too much emphasis on foreign policy, because unless you have stabilized your domestic environment, there's not much you can do. All those other countries have representatives in Nigeria. They can see what is going on. You have an open book. They can read you. And therefore, they know when it is you are doing things to put your house in order. We need to do that first.
I have been speaking with Professor Walaba Ogunsanwo, a professor of international relations and Nigeria's former ambassador to Botswana, Belgium, and the European Union. Formerly of the University of Lagos, he now lectures at Leeds City University. I have to go now. Hope you had a nice time listening. Your comment is valuable. Please send it to the email address eobilo@splashfm1055.com. eobilo@splashfm1055.com. For text message only, the number is 080 999 18449. 080 999 18449. You can leave a message for me on my Twitter page. My handle is @eobilo. Blessed Akum was the sound engineer responsible for this package. I am Edmund Obilo. Thanks for listening.